Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all. We're thrilled to have you here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Elite Hassan. I'm a graduate student in disaster and emergency management, and I organize this event alongside Professor David Etkin, Dr. Olivier Rubin, and Dr. Sandy Smith. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our 9-part webinar series, Exploring Ethics, Lessons from COVID-19 and Other Catastrophes. Our aim for this series is to share knowledge between academics and practitioners, identify research priorities, and help create a better network for those involved in this field. Our series will take place every Wednesday right here on the same Zoom link and generally at this time. So we look forward to seeing you on Wednesdays right here from April to June. For the duration of the presentation, all of you will be muted, but we look most forward to your contributions during our Q&A session at the end, where we will of course unmute you and take your questions. Please also feel free to use our chat to share your thoughts, insights, and questions. We will take a look at all of these messages during our Q&A period as well. When we begin the presentation, we will be recording, but please rest assured the only person whose video is recorded is our speaker. We'll upload these recordings so those who missed the event can view the presentations while keeping anonymity of those asking questions. We are so glad you joined us, and we are thrilled to be presenting you with this series. We'll now have Dr. Olivier Rubin introducing our speaker for today.
Thanks, Lee, for this very nice introduction. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and co-organizer, David Etkin. David is a professor in disaster ethics and emergency management at York University, Canada. His focus is primarily on disaster ethics and disaster risk assessments. He's the author of several books, including Disaster Theory and Ethical Emergency Manager. And I consider David to be a close colleague, but I have never met him in person. He was supposed to visit me at Roskilde University, Denmark in 2020, and we had also planned two ethics workshops together, but due to COVID-19, all had to be cancelled. So I've only experienced David in 2 dimensions, but that has been more than enough to appreciate his dedication, creativity, and insights. And I'm sure you will agree when I give the floor to David. David, go ahead.
There, can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for coming to this webinar series. I hope you all find it interesting and useful. So my talk is going to be about context, specifically the context. Oh, I need to share screen though. Give me one moment. Okay, are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was starting off, my talk is about context, specifically the context of the 20th and 21st centuries as it relates to disaster ethics. And one of the main points I want to make in this talk is that I believe there's an ethical deficit, and that's where I'm going to be heading to in the end, with this presentation. And the thing is, we have a lot of knowledge, and knowledge gives us power. We have an abundance of that, but ethics reveals to us how to use it. But how we use our power, I think, is highly problematical. And so an important question we need to ask ourselves really is how we're doing. I would like to start with a little poll. Just looking at what you think of trends, our ability to manage them, and how important ethics are to managing disasters. So I just have to pull up the poll option. I think I may have to stop share for a minute to do that. So I'm just going to stop sharing and go to polls. Okay, so I've launched a small poll here. There are just 3 questions for you to answer, and I have to I'll give you a minute to answer the questions and then share the results. Okay, I'll just give you a few more seconds and then close it off. Okay. Okay, so sharing the results. So while almost everybody feels that disaster impacts are getting much worse than it used to be or worse, in terms of our ability to manage large disasters and catastrophes, some people feel we're doing good, but a majority are saying just okay or poor, or a couple of people even terrible. And in terms of ethics, and it's probably bias here because if you didn't think it was important, you wouldn't have come to this webinar, but a large majority of you feel it's really important. Okay, I'll go back to share screen. And continue on with the presentation. So in terms of what I want to cover, what I'm planning on covering today, the first issue I want to talk about is micro-rationality and how when it's aggregated, it can become irrational on macro scales. I want to talk about complexity and wicked problems. The fact that we're in a zero-sum game, environmentally speaking, and what importance that has for planetary boundaries. Our social contract, which is between governments and their citizens, how well we're doing, and then finally have some concluding thoughts. So in terms of the aggregation of rationality, I want you to just look at that cartoon in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. And in all those cars, everybody is thinking the same thing. If those idiots would just take the bus, I could be home by now. And they're all right. On an individual level, it can make sense for people to drive a car to work or other places. But when everybody does it, the system can become dysfunctional and self-destructive. And this is a tragedy of the commons kind of problem, and can be applied to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, climate change, and many of the other threats that we face in this world. And it's rooted in this idea that what is rational at micro scales or individual scales, when it aggregates, can aggregate to irrationality in a macro scale. One good example of this is the emission of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide in particular. And there's a graph there showing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the past 800,000 years on the left side, and since 1950 on the right half of that. And you can see that currently we're exceeding historical ranges by a very significant amount. So for any one particular nation state that benefits from the industrial and economic activity and growth that results in the emission of carbon dioxide, it makes sense for those states to do it on an individual level. Oh, and all the states do it, it can result in ruin for all. And the main point here that I'm trying to make is that globalization that has been occurring over the past century, along with growths of population, economies, and so forth, are resulting in outcomes from systems that actually oppose the values that created them in the first place. In the sense that they're no longer making life better, they're making life worse for us in many ways. And this has ethical implications. So, for example, because we're aggregating from an individual level, and that aggregation has these kinds of unintended consequences, I'm going to argue that we need a greater emphasis on communitarian and egalitarian values and principles, and shift away from individualism and libertarian perspectives. And also, we need to pay a lot more attention to the ethics of systems, including artificial intelligence, and the notion of ethical communities as opposed to ethical individuals. Certainly in academia, we're seeing a trend in this direction. So this graph, for example, shows the number of publications that have occurred in, or been published in artificial intelligence ethics and roboethics from 2005 to 2020. And you can see there's been a dramatic increase. I'm not sure to what extent these sorts of perspectives are being shown in civil society as well. But I really think it's important that we shift away from the traditional Western ethical perspective of looking at individuals and individual decision making and look at it from more of a systems perspective. One issue that has been particularly important over the past couple of years is the notion of liberty as a moral domain. So the moral domain typically consists of the notions of like harm, fairness, purity, authority, and loyalty. And there's an interesting set of literature on that. And liberty is now being considered as another moral domain. And especially in the United States, for example, it has an important history. And there's a very famous quote called, "Give me liberty or give me death." And liberty is certainly an important value that is very meaningful to us in the West. And these notions have carried over. And for example, we've had the freedom convoys in Canada that were focused, at least supposedly focused on liberty issues. But it raises some interesting questions, especially with COVID. And the question is, to what extent should our governments be paternalistic and tell people what's good for them in order to serve the greater good or to fulfill their duties as governments? Or to what extent should they allow citizens to pursue their private interests? So this is just a graph I picked up looking at weekly US COVID death rates for all ages. And the top bar is unvaccinated death rates. And below that, we have two more bars for vaccinated individuals, both without boosters and then with boosters. And you can see a dramatic difference there. And so this whole notion of give me liberty or give me death actually can have a very literal meaning these days when there are pandemics or issues that affect other people. So some decisions are individual, but some decisions affect others. And because this was a public health issue, it really broadens our duties beyond the individual to include others in the community. So that's an important component of our ethical decision-making. And we live in systems that are highly complex. And this is a global risk interconnections map that was put together by the World Economic Forum. And it just shows links between all sorts of different systems and threats. At the top, we have natural disasters and the failure of climate change mitigation adaptation. In the middle, we have state collapse. There's social instability, terrorist attacks, failure of financial mechanisms, and so on. And these things are not separate from each other. They're all linked in a complex web of interconnectivity. And so the system that we are in, this complex system, this world, is very different from the way it used to be, which is the reason why I was interested in this topic. It's more complex, it's more interconnected, and what are the implications of that? Well, in terms of disasters just don't happen. We have hazards, but there's exposure, vulnerabilities, the decisions people make that create vulnerability and risk. And so to a large degree, disasters are derivatives of the context within which they exist. So as the world is becoming more complex and more interconnected, so are disasters. Additionally, this chaotic, complex, interconnected world that we live in is being subjected to a series of massive shocks. Examples are population growth, climate change, urbanization, environmental degradations, extinction of species, homogenization of agriculture, and so forth. And when you have a system like this, which is subject to those kinds of shocks, so this just comes straight out of chaos theory, the result is you have a system that lacks predictability. It is sensitive to small perturbation. So all large things have small beginnings, and sometimes something that doesn't seem particularly important when it first happens will become very important later on. These systems exhibit self-organization properties and often will go through transformative changes. And the very notion that we can control these systems is a flawed one. If you're talking about a well-defined system that's well-bounded and well understood, then you can have high degrees of control over it. But when you have these complex interconnected systems, the very notion that they can be controlled in a centralized way is just not a valid notion. Next thing I want to bring up is fat tails, which is something you may or may not have heard about, but I think is a really interesting aspect of how we understand disasters. So I'm beginning with a graph here, which is not a fat tail, but does represent the way most people see the world. And this is a normal distribution or a bell curve distribution. And when we think about like how tall people are, the salaries of teachers, our grades of students were often bell curved. We often think in terms of this kind of distribution. Until we'll think of normal or average, and these sorts of concepts are important and meaningful and give a lot of information about the kind of thing that we're talking about. But it turns out that much of the world doesn't look like that at all. Much of the world actually looks like what's called a power law. And here I have a graph, for example, of city populations in the United States. It's a histogram, and so the y-axis is just basically the number of cities or percentage, and the x-axis is population size. You can see it looks very different. And what you have is a very large number of cities with low populations, and then fewer cities with very large populations. And there's a large number of distributions that look like this and not like bell curves. So it's not just city populations. Many hazards like earthquake magnitudes or tornado frequencies, for example, follow power law distributions that have fat tails, and so do disaster impacts. And in these kinds of distributions, what really matters is not the average. It's not useful to think in terms of average or standard deviation. What we really need to do is think about in terms of the fatness of the tail. And this is just one example. So I went to NOAA's US billion-dollar weather disasters, where they have a list of all weather disasters since about 1980 or so, where the impact is more than $1 billion. So anything less than $1 billion is not included in this data set. And what I put together here is a histogram of tropical cyclones and hurricanes that hit the US that had that level of impact. And I just looked at the number of fatalities that occur with those, and that's a pretty robust statistic. So if you take a look at it, we had a bunch of events, say here 26, where it was 0 or 1 to 20 billion. We had 8 events between 20 and 40, 6 events between 40 and 60, and so forth. And so we have a curve that's coming downward here. And then 2 big events, which are Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria. And I had to put in a big gap between those 2 graphs because it went from 140 deaths to over 1,700 deaths. And it turns out if you just take those 2 events, that encompasses 72% of the total fatalities, whereas the mean is 120 fatalities per event because there were so many that were smaller. And the point here is that if we want to understand risk associated with hurricane impacts, the mean, which is 120, or looking at the smaller ones, is just not that helpful. And what we really have to do is look at the tail of the distribution to get a sense for why it's like that. So because hurricanes or because disasters have fat tails, that very different kind of distribution, it's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. Now, as I've just said, it's not helpful to think in terms of averages or expected values or variances. These fat tails tend to exist because there are strong underlying dynamics like feedback loops. And an example of this is wealth. So if you take a look at wealth distributions. It certainly varies by country, but it tends to be fat-tailed as well. So in the world, a small percentage of people own an enormous amount of the world's wealth. The same in the United States. If you look at the top 1%, the top 0.1%, a relatively small amount of the number of the population has a lot of the wealth. And that's because wealth creates opportunities to accumulate more wealth. And there's a feedback loop there. And that's what creates that fat tail. And here I have a quote from one paper was published just a couple of years ago that notes that tail risks are becoming increasingly important and common because of a more interconnected and fragile global system. So part of the modern world and the way it's being constructed and globalization and so forth is making these kinds of tail risks just more important. And this has also important ethical implications, which is that where you have a power law, ruinous events are much more likely, even though their probability is very difficult to contemplate or to calculate. Thus, we have to have a much stronger emphasis on the precautionary principle and think in terms of risk avoidance. I know this can be a concept that can be a bit hard to wrap your mind around at first. So just to give an example, I live near a big park called High Park in Toronto, and there are raccoons in the park, and every once in a while I'm walking around and I'll see a raccoon. Now, the size of raccoons or their weights is normally distributed. So let's say the average raccoon weighs, say, 20 pounds. And I'm, well, more pounds than I should be, but I'm a lot more than 20 pounds, probably 10 times that much. But I don't have to worry when I go outside. I don't have to be fearful because I'm going to be attacked by a raccoon. They're all pretty small. If raccoon distributions, if the size of raccoon distributions was a fat tail distribution, so, and the average was say 20 pounds, I'd go outside and most of the raccoons would probably be 10 or 12 pounds. It'd be pretty small. And then all of a sudden I'd walk around a corner and there'd be a 150-pound raccoon. And then I would have to worry because that's a big raccoon that I have to worry about. So that's the difference between normal distributions and fat tail distributions. With the fat tail distributions, you have to pay attention to the extremes because they just happen more often. And they're a reality that we need to contend with. Now, the kind of world that we're in, this kind of world where we have complex system, which is dynamically connected, wicked problems are something that we're running into more and more often. On the right here, I just have a chart I picked up just to illustrate a wicked problem as being something that is both complex and complicated. So we have a transition from in the bottom left-hand corner of that matrix of tame problems to problems that become more complex and finally wicked. And wicked problems are just extremely difficult to deal with. The original paper on this was written in 1974, and there's been a lot of discussion and publishing and research on wicked problems since that time. I have the reference in the bottom of the slide. So from that original paper, here are some of the characteristics that they talk about, which is that you don't have true or false solutions, which makes ethical analysis difficult, for example. You tend to have solutions that are, well, instead of good or bad, I'll say better or worse, depending on your values. There is no way to test solutions, and solutions tend to be irreversible. So you can think about climate change as an example. They can always be described as symptoms of other problems, and framing determines possible solutions. So for example, if you think about climate change, if you frame it as a technological problem, then you're going to look at engineering kinds of solutions. If you frame it as a political problem, then you're going to look for state-based solutions. If you frame it as a community-based problem, then you're going to engage in sort of a civil discourse. And all these can be valid, but depending how it's framed, it leads you in different directions. And one point that's made is that people who present solutions to these problems, they say, have no right to be wrong because of the consequences of that. War is another example of a wicked problem, and we're seeing that certainly with Russia and Ukraine. And one of the issues is, in terms of framing, is war a problem or a solution to another problem? So much of the world is seeing the war there as a problem. But to Russia, war was a solution to another problem that they had. So when something is both a problem and a solution at the same time, then you have these different framing perspectives and different, certainly different ethical understandings of what's going on. I did a literature search about wicked problems and just found a number of comments that I wanted to share with you that I found interesting about them. One is, and these are all quotes from papers that were written about them, we have to be both scientific and poet, which means it's not just about numbers, it's not just about sort of hard observed facts, it's about values, perspectives, worldviews, and philosophy. The kinds of traditional ethical analyses that we do, typically say utilitarian analysis or Kantian or deontological analysis, they are just not well suited to dealing with wicked problems. So traditional ethics, Western ethics, those perspectives are just problematical. And as we try and deal with them, they are politically contentious, again marked by framing contests, and are often oversimplified and cast in emotional or value-laden terms, which make it very difficult to deal with. They require complex and iterative approaches to try and solve them. They tend to lurch from crisis to crisis. They have multiple interconnections, and the whole notion that we can control these problems just is not valid. So that's like the comment I made before about just if you have a complex system, notions of control are just flawed. And even though they may have no right answers, or certainly no one right answer, but no right answers that everybody can agree on, they also seem to have plenty of wrong ones. And they represent an ethical conundrum for us. Very difficult to deal with ethically. There may be no good moral stances that can be generally accepted, and yet we're faced with these serious problems that we still need to try and deal with. The next topic I want to address is the zero-sum game, from an environmental perspective. And this means, a zero-sum game means that one person or one agent can only win at the expense of another agent losing. And playing poker is a good example of this. And the Earth is considered to be in a zero-sum game right now. We're overusing the Earth's natural resources significantly. And this is called ecological overshoot. And when you're an ecological overshoot, outcomes inevitably say that things have to balance out, which means you have to enter undershoot and possibly collapse. It's like overspending your income and your savings. You can do it for a while, but then you build up debt, and eventually, that economic model will collapse. And so what does our future look like? Our future is going to look like that graph at the left. The longer we sustain this ecological overshoot, the greater the price we're going to have to pay down the road. And how bad is this ecological overshoot? Well, one way, there are various ways of looking at it. One way is this notion of planetary boundaries. So this is a chart showing planetary boundaries for a variety of issues. For example, ozone depletion, ocean acidification, biogeochemical flows, freshwater use, land system changes, the biosphere, climate change, and novel entities, which includes, for example, chemicals and plastics, for example. The green area in the middle is what's considered to be a safe operating space. And I'm not sure it's possible to delineate it just by one thin line. And I'm sure there's some disagreement about where that safe operating space is. But nevertheless, the analysis we have suggests that in a number of these areas, we're dramatically exceeding the safe operating space, which is the planetary boundary. And that's shown by the orange colors. the darker the color and the further it is away from that green area, the more serious it is in terms of consequences to planetary boundaries. And just for example, if we look at synthetic chemicals, I just have a box here just showing how much we're putting into the system. 1973, 2.3 billion tons of synthetic chemicals, twice as much as we did 17 years before that. And we're continuing to put thousands of new novel substances into the planet on a daily basis. What are the consequences of this? Well, one thing I'll say is that many of these novel chemicals, for example, that we put into the system are really not very well understood, especially in terms of how they interact with each other. The ozone hole is a great example of a consequence of this. So for many years, we were using chlorofluorocarbons for a variety of industrial and other purposes. And it's an inert chemical, and everybody thought it would not be a problem. But it turns out that in the presence of ultraviolet radiation, polar stratospheric clouds, where the temperature is below 80 degrees Celsius, it's ozone destroying. And ozone, at ground level is a bad thing, but ozone in the upper atmosphere is a good thing because it protects us from ultraviolet radiation, which can cause skin cancer, for example. Now, on the right-hand side, I have a picture of the ozone hole over the Antarctic in the year 2000, where it was close to a minimum. And the graph shows the ozone levels in what's called Dobson units going back to the 1950s and shows how it decreased. Now, we did create the Montreal Protocol, which basically tried to eliminate the production of CFCs. And it was largely successful. And if you take a look at the graphs since the late mid-1990s, it's more or less stabilized. But I'm wondering, what if? So what if chlorofluorocarbons, instead of having a half-life of 50 to 80 years, so it means they're going to be dissipating relatively quickly, what if the half-life had been hundreds of years or maybe thousands of years? Some chemicals have half-lives of thousands of years. What if instead of that photochemical reaction occurring at -80, suppose it happened at -30 degrees? If it had happened at -30 degrees, then it would have been global in extent instead of restricted to the polar regions. So if we go through this what if scenario, we would have been in a global catastrophe instead of something that we were able to manage. So it's not that we were smart, it's just that we were lucky. And here we're subjecting this complex system to all these novel substances and shocks in ways that we do not have a good handle on. So the idea is that in the future, are we going to experience more surprises like this? It just seems a high risk to me.
So David, you have 10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So the ethical implications of this are important for environmental ethics, precautionary principle, and duty to future generations. Each of these must loom much larger in our ethical imagination and in our decision-making. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit just to get through things. So next I wanted to address our social contract and how well it's doing. And the basis of the social contract is trust between citizens and governments. In some countries, like this top graph shows, China is doing pretty well. Others, not so much. And the bottom chart, which is a global survey looking at how ethical and competent NGOs, businesses, and governments are perceived, shows that whereas NGOs and businesses aren't doing too badly, governments are just perceived as being both immoral and incompetent. And to some degree, this is because of perceived corruption. So this is a corruption perceptions index. On the left, you can see countries with perceived high levels of corruption, which are the red countries, the higher numbers. And the histogram on the right shows that Actually, the corruption perceptions index for over half the countries in the world is pretty high. So trust is low and perceived corruption is high in many places around the world. And specifically, if we look at the United States, surveys of trust, using this question down here, do you trust the government in Washington to do what's right just about always or most of the time, has shown a dramatic increase of over 70% in the late 1950s and 60s, down to about 20% currently. And this goes along with perceptions of increased corruption as well. How has post-modernity affected the social contract? So aspects of post-modernity are things like ethical relativism, that there's no one thing that's right, it's all sort of relative to the culture you're coming from, a rejection of the grand narrative, but especially this notion of being in a post-truth society, or that we all have our own truths. And I'm going to suggest that this has worsened our ability to manage complex situations and wicked problems. And it really comes down to the difference between belief and knowledge. And there is this notion of rational belief. So in rational belief, it means we have beliefs, but we try to seek evidence for it. And there's something called epistemological duty, which is the idea that we have a duty to seek unbiased evidence to support our beliefs. And I think very often this doesn't happen and can be very difficult to do. Depending on the kind of issue being looked at, it can be extraordinarily difficult to be unbiased when it's an issue connected to our worldview or core beliefs. So this particular graph illustrates different responses to risk associated with global warming. Addressing global warming requires cooperative solutions where individuals cede liberties and rights for the greater good. And egalitarians and communitarians, for example, are comfortable with this. But those in the political right with more libertarian perspectives tend to be uncomfortable with those solutions. I would have expected that as science literacy scores increase, which is the x-axis, people would have higher estimates of climate change risk, because it's basically a science-based perspective. But these surveys show that whereas that's true for communitarians, it is not true for people with individualist perspectives, which is more of the political right. And that is because this information gets filtered through the matrix of belief systems, and this is about cognitive conservatism. It's like believing is seeing instead of seeing is believing. So depending on the issue you're addressing, this notion of having a duty to have unbiased beliefs, can be pretty challenging. Like the Flat Earth Society. The ethical implications of all of this in terms of the social contract is that trust is being lost, and a lot of trust has been lost. And this affects the capacity and ability of government to manage these very contentious problems. Leaders, especially political leaders, need to be perceived to be more virtuous. And actually, if you look at trust as a function of profession, politicians are almost always at the bottom of that list. They're just not trusted. And I think our social systems and political systems don't encourage the development of trust. Critical infrastructure is another really important issue. In North America, about 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. And the primary duties of the private sector are maximizing profit and acting in the best interests of shareholders. Whereas the primary duty of government is to serve the public good. But I would argue that critical infrastructure is a public good. So the fact that so much critical infrastructure lies within the private sector, I think, is a problematical aspect of the social contract we have. I'm just going to skip this slide in the interest of time. And I think we need to reevaluate that and take a close look at the duties of government to the public good and to their citizens in terms of, privatization of critical infrastructure. Finally, there's what's called situational ethics. The psychological evidence is overwhelming that our ethical, our moral positions is dominated by the situations we find ourselves in as compared to our natural dispositions. And here's one quote that under the right conditions, good people can be induced, seduced, and initiated into behaving in evil ways. So this notion of situational ethics, I just think, is incredibly important and relates to this whole issue of moral traps, of which, for example, authoritarianism is an important one. We all work in organizations, perhaps very large organizations, and there are several aspects of organizations that are problematical in terms of ethical decision-making and ethical behavior. And this is based on studies of different organizations, and it shows that as organization size increases, individual ethical beliefs and decision-making behavior decreases. Similarly, when you rise to higher levels within the organization, you get a similar effect. And then there's this whole issue of conformity, which is one of the moral traps, that people's beliefs and decision-making become congruent with top management beliefs. And the result is that people who work in larger organizations are subjected to situational forces that decreases moral behavior, which really reinforces the need for moral leadership, professional codes of conduct, both for individuals and organizations, and cultural changes. So finally, my concluding thoughts, and I'm sorry I've gone on a bit too long here, is that there are a number of factors and pressures in modern society that are important to context in terms of ethical decision-making that I've just gone through, and that the result is that they are creating what I consider to be an ethical deficit in our world, in that we're just not culturally and biologically programmed to deal with many of the serious global ethical issues that we're experiencing now. And so the question we're going to have to think about is how to move forward from this point. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, David, for this all-encompassing, I would say. There's hardly a topic you didn't cover, an exciting presentation, and also, of course, thought-provoking and a little bit depressive, if I can be so free. So I think we should open the floor for questions. You can write the questions in the chat, or you can sort of raise your digital hand, and we'll take your questions. If there are no questions, then maybe I can ask one, but I'll give you the chance. There has to be some questions, I guess. Yeah, there's a question here from Christina. Edith, will you unmute? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Would you mind showing that graph again, where you showed what constitutes a wicked problem? I'd like to see what the definitions are on the two axes again.
Sure. No, I'm just going to share screen again. Okay. Is this the one you meant?
Yeah. Hang on. Where am I?
So I didn't include all of the aspects of the wicked problem that's in the original paper, but I included what I thought were the more important ones for the purposes of this talk.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question from the chat as well, and that's also a question I would like to know the answer to. Of course, it's difficult, but how do we refill the ethical deficit? Is it done in schools, religion, or politics, or any advice? Right? I mean, it's good enough to sketch out the problems, but what do you say, Dave?
Yeah, so I don't think there's one answer to that question. I think there are multiple prongs that should be taken. Certainly, if ethics is taught in schools more, that would be helpful. But then we live in a society where, schools aren't supposed to do that kind of thing. It's supposed to be the kind of thing that's done at home or in church or synagogue or whatever. We need to pay a lot more attention to ethics. So I think if organizations, governments made it more explicitly a part of what they do and their policies and the process of decision making, I think that kind of top-down leadership would be important. And I think just bringing it up in various events and talking about it and how ethics underlies much of what we do is important. I don't have a perfect answer to that. It's what's called a wicked problem. I'm trying to do my little bit by doing talks like this. I'm not sure if that was very helpful. I just saw a question by Christina.
Okay, then I don't want to. Yeah, go ahead, David.
So, actually, Sandy, do you want to answer this one and talk about our project?
I'm happy to do so. The question was, is the end game of this to have a code of ethics for emergency management? I think I got the full question. And if not, in your opinion, what would be the process of creating a code of ethics for our professional community? And the answer is the Ethics SIG special interest group from FEMA Higher Education Program has developed a code of ethics for emergency management. This was done over 2 years. Is that correct? I think that's correct, Dave.
Yeah.
A little over 2 years in the making, and through this past June to December of 2021, it was out for public comment. We received analyzed the comments that those who provided feedback to us about this code of ethics. There were 33 standards. There now, I believe, is 31 standards. We collapsed some of them, and it is going to be available for further reflection. The Ethics SIG of the FEMA Higher Education Program. If you're interested in it, if you would please put in the chat your email address, we will send it to you. We're having a meeting at the end of April and would love to have your further reflection about this code of ethics and standards for professional conduct. Anything else you want to add, Dave?
No, I think you summarized it perfectly. So, Nicholas, how do you see the capacities of individuals involved in disaster planning response to face this ethical deficit with their stakeholders? I guess it just depends on who you are and what organization you're working in terms of capacity. If anybody who's involved in the humanitarian sector, for example, is kind of in a better scenario from ethically speaking, just because humanitarianism pays so much attention to the ethical basis of what they do. If you're in the more narrow, say, emergency management side of things in the private sector or the public sector, then ethics is notable by its absence. And I think as individuals, we have a significant capacity to interest people in this topic, because my sense is that when you engage people with it and show specific examples of why it's important, they get really interested in it. So it just varies the situation, but I think we can all, be a fairly effective in terms of creating, a bigger window into this field.
Thanks. I can see there are a lot of requests for the code of ethics, but not questions as far as I can tell. So maybe I can forward my own questions. So my question is, it seems like that we've become better at addressing rapid onset or minor disasters or crises in terms of the ethics. But what you refer to here are all the sort of major transboundary, slow onset disasters where the ethics becomes much more complex. I mean, you can't just say it's triage and so what is the relationship? I mean, can we borrow something from what we already have in terms of these ethical guidelines to minor crises, minor disasters, and scale them up? Or do we need sort of a whole new ethical system to deal with these very broad crises and disasters?
I think scaling up is problematical. If we go back to, for example, the sociologist Quarantelli, who posed the question, are emergencies, disasters, and catastrophes qualitatively or quantitatively different? In other words, is a disaster just a big emergency? And the answer we've all come up with is no. So it's not, if it was just the same thing but bigger, like a little dog and a big dog, then you could just scale up what you do. But if you have a little dog and then you have a boa constrictor, that's a different kind of beast, and you aren't going to want to feed it treats by hand. So really, I think it's not just a question of scaling up, but considering the ethical implications that the systems behave in different ways. And one example of this is just the precautionary principle becomes so much more important when we're dealing with these wicked problems and large complex disasters. Whereas where you're dealing with a smaller emergency that's well bounded and well understood, then you really don't need to use that so much.
Thanks. Any other questions? I know you have to leave at 5, but we have time for 1 or 2 more. Maybe then I have 1 more, maybe.
Okay.
No, here we go. How can people become more aware and reflective of falling into moral traps? Oh, that's the lead. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so moral traps is a really interesting area, although there has not been a lot written about it. And there are different kinds of moral traps. One kind of moral trap is just a dilemma where you have to choose between 2 rights and 2 wrongs. But in other kinds of moral traps, people's agency is taken away, or they're subject to perhaps perceptual blindness. So one thing, just search out readings on it through Google Scholar or on the internet. There's one book, I can't remember the name of it right now, that's written on moral traps that's available, and lists like 47 or 48 of the different moral traps. That's pretty useful. But I just heard of a report of some of the atrocities that Russian soldiers, for example, are committing in Ukraine. And sometimes one kind of moral trap is people giving up their sense of moral responsibility when they're in an authoritarian structure, and people at higher levels of that structure say, do this, do that. So they cede their sense of moral authority to other people, and then they're capable of doing what are considered horrendous acts. So that's one kind of moral trap associated with authoritarianism or extreme authoritarianism. But there are many others as well, like rationalization. Who of us doesn't rationalize from time to time? There's probably dozens of rationalizations as to why it's okay for us to do something, when we really know it's wrong. It might be slippery slope, or everybody else does it, or whatever rationalization we use. So yeah, just search out moral traps. And if anybody wants to send me an email, I'm just going to type. I think everybody has my email. I'll just type it in so you've got it. Send it to everyone. I have a little material, moral traps, that could be a start for you. So I could just slip it over to you if you want to look at it. I have a textbook called the Ethical Emergency Manager that I've been using to teach courses in emergency management ethics at York University. And there is a piece in it on moral traps.
So maybe we have time for the last question, Dave, before you have to go. So it's from Mani Weber. If disasters are always considered in the public good domain, then presumably the power decision maker for management of disasters is the government. Should disasters be jointly managed by public and private sectors together? So what are the sort of ethical implications or practical sort of implications of this joint venture?
Yeah, so it should certainly be jointly managed because they're all stakeholders. One issue that's become apparent to me, though, is a problem with having politicians as the ultimate decision makers during a disaster, because politicians end up in a no-win scenario. And they're subject to political pressures, which do not necessarily coincide with what might be public health measures or the public good. So managers of disasters, they have to be accountable. You have to have social accountability, that's for sure. And politicians are accountable at the election box. But there are other models as well. For example, the Bank of Canada is not run by a politician, it's run by a senior civil servant who is an expert in the field. So I don't know, to my mind, it might be interesting at least to explore the issue of should the ultimate decision makers in terms of managing disasters be professionals and experts in disaster management as opposed to politicians. I think it's something we should seriously look at. Consider, say, a Bank of Canada model instead of the existing system. But it certainly should be a cooperative effort by all stakeholders, absolutely.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. And with that, we will end this presentation or session. And thank you very much. So next session will be already on Wednesday. It'll be Dr. Austin Dalgo, who will talk about the ethics surrounding the distribution of the vaccine allocation for COVID-19, and how they're clustered in or how they're sort of the distribution in disadvantaged community versus advantaged communities, and how to deal with the ethical dilemmas of that. So I hope to see all of you there as well. And yeah, thank you very much for participating today, and see you next Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.